Hello and welcome to the Transport Leaders podcast, where we discuss the breakthrough ideas and bold solutions transforming the future of transport around the world. Join a global community of leaders, professionals, academics, and advocates as we unpack transport's toughest challenges and spotlight these strategies driving real change. From system reform levers and political realities to sustainability and technological disruption, experienced transport professionals Graham McCabe and Russell King, that's me, and their guests offer expert perspectives as we discuss ways to transform our transport systems.
G'day, I'm Graham McCabe. I'm the founder of Step Advisory, a transport planning and engineering firm, and I've worked in consultancy and government for over 25 years across Australasia and Asia.
And I'm Russell King. I'm a transport strategist and founder of the Transport Leader blog and newsletter, and I've worked on the policy side of transport for around 20 years. Good afternoon, Graham. What have we got today? What are we talking about today? What's our interesting topic for the discussion today? What are we going to be challenging in transport systems world today?
Well, I think it's a good one that you've been talking about in your blog posts, and that is carpooling and high occupancy vehicle lanes.
Fantastic. This is a really easy one. This will take 2 minutes, won't it, Graham? It's just like everyone needs to share cars, okay, in order to get to trips. No more single occupancy. We go from 1 person per car to 4 people per car. We get rid of 75% of the cars and all is good. Transport system solved.
How do you get those people into those cars? Who do you get to those people? Who do you ride
You're
with?
just being an awkward person, aren't you? Indeed,
Well,
these are the challenges.
Will we start with Sydney or San Francisco? Which basket case?
There are so many basket cases around the world that it's too hard to pick. But let's start with San Francisco. I love San Francisco and got married not far from there in Sonoma, the wine region in Northern California. But we got our marriage license in San Francisco, so I'm very fond of the city.
So the Bay Bridge, high occupancy vehicle lane. Did it work? Short answer is no.
Why didn't it work?
Long answer is it took people off transit. Because so one of the great things about carpooling and introducing high occupancy vehicle lanes is you create a market incentive for people to become the extra person in the car in order to take use of the high occupancy vehicle lane. So Bay Bridge in San Francisco, Sydney Harbour Bridge, when they had transit lanes on the approaches to Sydney Harbour Bridge, you end up with queues of people who would otherwise be using a bus or a train, and they become free assets for carpooling. And this happens basically everywhere where you have carpooling, that you will have people, rather than creating genuine carpooling need, that you end up with a pseudo market for people filling cars and not actually reducing the number of travellers who are using their own car.
Are the numbers sort of just so straightforward? It's 100% that it's all from public transit or transport, or is it? Do the numbers vary?
So, from my experience with carpooling, and that goes back to the late 1990s, in trying to create a paper-based carpooling system at the time, which was quite interesting. Carpooling works when it's people who know each other. So you want to have some form of connection. So workplace carpooling is a success.
Mm-hmm.
Random people meeting on the street and, coming together through or a government-run database, things like that, where you don't know people's music preferences, you don't know the political alignment, you don't know how they feel about other members of the community, it just doesn't work. And it really hasn't worked anywhere in the world. And, which brings about, how, Uber came about, which was, the self-entitled young man didn't want to use transit in San Francisco to get around. So he created that in order to use other people's vehicles. And then realized that there was money in it. And Uber went from a carpooling experiment to a ride-hailing scheme.
I'm going to park on the issue on how Uber got to start, because I don't want to turn this into an Uber discussion, because I think there's too much there. But there's an important thing here as well. Uber did try an Uber pool approach, didn't it? Where it would have multiple riders in the same vehicle.
Yes. Yeah, and they've tried it more than once. So that was how they started, was as you're driving anyway, I'll hop in your vehicle and I'll pay you. And then later down the track, they also had Uber Pool, which was the same thing, but on a larger scale after they'd moved into the standard transportation network company, so competing directly with taxis. So they've had 2 attempts at it, and both of which have not been particularly successful, because the human psychology is, if you're on a train or a bus, it's okay to get away from somebody you don't particularly want to be next to. You can't do that in a car. Whereas, going back to the workplace carpooling, it works because it's people you already know, you already have a connection with, you're going to the same place at the same time, multiple days a week. And even when small places like districts, like Macquarie Park in Sydney, have attempted it, well, with people going to the same destination, working in the same industries, it still doesn't really work.
In Macquarie Park situation, and I might own up to a conflict of interest here potentially, because my wife works at Macquarie Park currently. Is it just because it's just too easy to drive into Macquarie Park? We've got huge roads leading into Macquarie Park. There is, it's a very car-friendly environment. We have office blocks with huge car parks around them, providing abundant parking. And even then, despite the fact that there are 3 metro stations and lots of bus services into Macquarie Park, the vast majority of people that work in Macquarie Park drive.
Yeah, well, Macquarie Park has lots of problems, particularly in terms of its bus network. While there's good amounts of bus lanes, the frequency and connectivity of services, and where people are coming from to work in that location, do result in it being generally easier in the scheme of things for people to drive. So yeah, and when you don't have a significant disincentive, so there's ample parking in Macquarie Park, and it's not too expensive in the scheme of things for for people who are working in technology and pharmaceuticals and government administration. They can afford the parking charges that are being levied. So there's no scarcity that would drive that behavior. And when you look at a company like Optus, which was for anyone international, it's a telecommunications company. They moved their head office from the Sydney CBD to Macquarie Park, and they had to put on free buses from the CBD to Macquarie Park in order to keep their stuff. So
Yes.
again, but that is carpooling, but on a large scale. An employer-run bus where only employees are on the bus. Connecting their previous office location to their new office location, so that the staff weren't driving.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So carpooling doesn't work in those scenarios. Are there some scenarios where it's worked in? I've seen some examples in France, for example, connecting peri-urban areas to the downtown or CBD areas of a town. They seem to work quite well in the sense that the peri-urban area has some sort of form of sort of community feel, going back to your point, and therefore it seems to work quite well in terms of people being part of the same community, maybe not a business community, but a sort of geographical community, and therefore removes the barrier to sharing.
Yeah, and it's that sense of connection. Going back to the ride-hailing companies, they now give you options of saying whether your driver is allowed to have music on or is allowed to talk to you.
Yes, all these things that are very awkward within a car share.
Yeah. So they're allowing somebody to express themselves by having music or their favorite podcast or radio station on, is a pro-social thing. So you can see why a for-profit company would be more about letting the customer control that, whereas in a carpooling environment, the passengers don't have as much choice, aside from choosing, well, I want to carpool with Jane rather than Ashish, or I want to carpool with Ashish rather than Jane, because of a commonality or social connection. So there's things that reduce congestion a lot more than carpooling, and that's public transport, or even just letting people work from home.
Yes. So you talked about San Francisco. It didn't work on the Golden Gate Bridge.
Bay Bridge. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, the Bay Bridge.
Yeah.
What's happened in Sydney?
So there's been numerous attempts at setting up government organised carpooling schemes. And they generally fall flat on their face. Very small interest take up. Again, are you going to turn up? Are you going to take your car to a car park and hop in a random stranger's car based on them joining the same app as you? Who takes account for the insurance if something happens? And that's multiple aspects of, a car crash, just all types of things. So the idea of hopping into a random stranger's house, or having a random stranger come to your house every weekday to pick you up until you get to know them, would you do that?
It's an interesting thing, but people do that for rideshare. They do it in big numbers, right? I mean, it's not as though rideshare is not a niche thing anymore, right? I mean, the same argument was said about rideshare before, right? I wouldn't get into a stranger's car. This is a nuts idea. It's one of the reasons that it was kind of like it was, there were venture capitalists who said, no, this is madness. This will never work. People aren't going to, get into somebody stranger's car, but they did, and they do.
Yeah, but the amount of effort that's put into assuring people of the safety of the system, regardless of how much actual reality there is in that. And when rideshare first started, people wouldn't put in their real address; they'd put in their neighbour's address in order to not have a rideshare. Ride hailing, because they're not sharing. a ride hailing driver not know their real address.
Yeah.
So, and they had to introduce things like share your location within the apps. People taking screenshots of the driver's details or the car and sending that to them. So that still occurs with ride hailing, because the apps have an issue of, if they have a troublesome driver, i.e. somebody who probably should be charged with a criminal offence, they just delete them off the platform. And then you can't get the information about that driver if you need to make a complaint to the police.
Yeah.
So a lot of people still do screenshots of the driver information and the vehicle information as a safety measure. So you take that to a step further, where people are already concerned about ride-hailing drivers, into a matched situation where you're matched with somebody who's going to the same location at the same time. You're basically getting into dating app territory of, swipe left, swipe right. Do I want to share a vehicle with this stranger?
Yes. So high occupancy vehicle lanes, which we've got a few of in Sydney.
Yeah.
Are they just a complete waste of time, or do they have some sort of purpose?
So if you think about the different types, so we have what are called transit lanes, which are either 2 or 3 occupants, plus there's been historical other exemptions for motorcycles, taxis, and now electric cars are able to use them. So the biggest problem is the enforcement aspect of, you need to either have a technology-based system, increasingly more feasible, or you need to have dedicated officers enforcing lanes, whether they're traffic enforcement or police. In the Sydney context, it's always been police doing it. So if you've got 20 odd kilometres of high occupancy vehicle lanes spread around the city, then the likelihood of someone who's ignoring that getting caught is pretty low.
Yep. Now,
though I did say I can't actually get fined for driving in the bus lane last week, which is nice.
Oh, that's a good positive story.
Yeah.
It's a shame that you felt surprised. That's the only problem. It should be sort of just standard. But anyway, moving on. So that's the high occupancy vehicle lanes, HOVs. But in some places, I don't think there's any in Sydney as far as I'm aware, there are also high occupancy toll lanes.
Yes.
So is it just that a high occupancy vehicle lane is free for anybody with more than 2 or 3 people in the vehicle? Yeah. And a high occupancy toll lane is just the same thing, but you pay, or is there other differences as well?
No, it's there's a couple of types of high occupancy toll lanes. One is where you have an exemption for people in a high occupancy vehicle. And that requires manual checking. Generally, you actually have a toll booth gate that you have to go through and demonstrate that you have real people, not mannequins, which has always been a problem with high occupancy vehicle lanes. Is still life in the car next to the driver.
It could be worse. It could be a corpse rather than a mannequin. But yeah.
Well, there's other things which should get you demonetized as well. So that's one type of high occupancy toll lane, and the other type is where you can pay extra to drive in the high occupancy vehicle lane in order to avoid the congestion in the other lanes. So Los Angeles, for example, does this where there's a couple of freeways where they will say you can pay $15 and you can use the high occupancy vehicle lane if there's not a lot of high occupancy vehicles using that one.
Yeah, so they change the demand. The price changes based on effectively the demand in the lane.
The availability of the lane.
Oh, is it not the price as well? Is the price? The price is. It's a yes or no, is it?
I honestly don't.
Okay, but you could see how you could dynamically price as well as.
Yes, you could. Yeah.
As well as a switch on an yes or a no. Okay, so a high occupancy vehicle lane probably not going to work generally.
But they're popular, particularly with politicians.
Go on.
Because, and this is where your background comes in. Is a politician might take the step to a high occupancy vehicle lane, but they may not take the step all the way to a bus lane or a bus only lane.
Yes, I think when you see either hot lanes or HOV lanes, they're often done on either new infrastructure or they are done where there is already at least 3 lanes in one direction. So they're going to convert one lane to a high occupancy vehicle lane, and it's effectively acts as a kind of partial bus lane, at least. Right? And it feels less of a political leap than going straight to a dedicated bus lane and having no option for motor vehicles.
Okay, so why do politicians get scared? So if the technocrats like me are saying, well, you've got 3,000 people in buses and 1,500 people in cars. We need a bus lane so we don't have to waste buses being stuck in congestion. Why do politicians listen to the 1,500 people in cars rather than the 3,000 people are in the bus?
That's a very good question. Let me go what I think it is. I mean, it's, politicians have different perspectives on these things. But I think that in the vast majority of cities, and this is especially true in car-dominated cities, politicians don't want to be ending up getting a reputation for being anti-car, because that means that you're looked upon negatively by all drivers, not just in a narrow corridor where you may be particularly making a decision which drivers may perceive as being anti-driver. So if you're converting, a general traffic lane into a dedicated bus lane or a high occupancy vehicle lane, but particularly a bus lane or a cycle lane, it's not that just that individual lane and the drivers affected in that area that you're worried about. It's all the other drivers having sympathy going, well, I wouldn't want to have that there either. And so suddenly you end up with a very anti-driver perception if you're a politician. And I think it's that's driving it. When drivers are a much smaller percentage of the mode share, that's much less of a concern. But when you've got cities where the mode share for drivers is 80% plus, then it's much more challenging, I think, from the politician's perspective. Now,
Right.
when you're converting, so it's not the numbers in the corridor necessarily. I don't think that worries them. I think it's the more broader perception issue, because the way that people will think is, they've done this to this group of people, am I next? Okay, and so I think that's why you end up with the broader concern. Okay, and why you go, well, I don't want them to do that to me, therefore it's, I'm against that. So I think that's where you end up with it, and why I think there's a significant benefit from a political perspective in the most difficult areas. I think if you're going from 3 lanes to an HOV lane stroke bus lane, I think that's not too bad, to be frank. I think that politically, I think that happens quite a lot. But if you've got 2 lanes, and we talked about Parramatta Road on an earlier podcast, the challenge in Parramatta Road is that there are stretches where it's just 2 lanes. And in those stretches, it's, if you're taking away a whole lane from general traffic, you're reducing the capacity by 50% in that stretch. And politicians get very nervy about that.
Yeah. So just going back to the being seen as anti-car. So this is where traditional media and social media has a outsized effect on public perception. So having worked on bus priority projects over the years, when you do the numbers and you go, okay, well, we know that the 10% improvement in bus travel time results in a 1% mode share. So every 1,000 cars, you're taking 10 out of the corridor. Similarly with reliability. So and increase in frequency. So putting in a bus lane can take 5 to 10% of the traffic off the road immediately. Going back to our discussion on congestion, often that's actually not considered within the modelling and analysis frameworks that are used. Increasingly more so, but historically hasn't. So when you have scare campaigns around, well, traffic congestion, travel will increase and travel times will increase and people won't be able to get their kids to school. And then that's propagated to, well, they've done this corridor, they're coming for you next. That's the fear of the politicians, is that people start saying, well, you're coming for me next, therefore I'm going to vote against you or advocate to my representatives to get rid of you as being the transport-related minister because you're anti-car.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think it's, it's easier to bag the media and the social media on this, but there's a vibe that's important when it comes to voting. So the vast majority of the public don't pay close attention to politics, right? And very few things get what they call cut through and become what we in Australia talk about, as a topic around the Barbie, right? That is a tiny proportion of all the stories in the political world that are spinning around. But it's amazing how car stories are one of those that does seem to make it quite easily into the discussion around the barbecue. And I think that's it's not necessarily the logical argument, it's the emotional one. and that vibe that this is an anti-car government, which is very rare, by the way. I mean, the vast majority of governments are not anti-car. They're providing huge amounts of subsidies to the cars. They're building more roads, etc. But all of that logical stuff, it's funny how one high-profile story about measures to prioritize public transport can create a reputation that is not normally justified, but does cut through.
So how do you, I've talked about why carpooling hasn't worked. You've talked about the political risk. So how do you change the emotions around carpooling and then the prioritization that needs to be given in order to make it feel worthwhile for people to do?
Yeah. And I think one of the things so my view on a lot of these things is transport generally, in policy terms, is not good at combining multiple policies together. We tend to think very much in sort of individual policy bits. And so I think we've got to combine a whole bunch of things together. So you talked about the need to, increase frequency of buses, and improve the service and journey times and all the rest of it. I think you have to pull lots of levers if you're going to convert from 2 lanes of general traffic to one with, say, bus priority and high occupancy vehicles, to one, and from 2 to 1, and plus the high occupancy vehicle lane. If you're going to do that, you want to be pulling multiple levers in order to be able to say, these are the things we're doing so that this works. You've got to get you've got to have lots of sort of arrows in your quiver to explain why you're doing everything you possibly can to make sure this doesn't create a massive, traffic bottleneck.
So,
right?
well, even going from 3 general traffic lanes to 2 general traffic lanes seems a bit of a stretch at the moment. So there hasn't been any conversions of lanes in Sydney, aside from the light rail construction in the last few years. So we've stopped doing that, and the bus priority program has focused on doing queue jumps. So giving, allowing buses to use a left turn lane, so a right turn for people in North America and Europe, to get up to the traffic lights and then jump ahead of the cars. So we don't do that. We're not doing that. We're not doing new installations, and the only one that's even been close has been the reverse decision on Parramatta Road to put in a transit lane rather than a bus, so a HOV.
Yeah. So I think part of that though is conflated with the fact that we have deprioritized buses generally as a mode in Sydney and in lots of other cities. Melbourne's the same. Melbourne only does trams; it doesn't do buses in a big way. And so I think there's been a lack of focus on it. There's lots of other things going on in the transport world, and one of the things I think that has been neglected, even though it's such an important mode, is buses. And I think therefore what's happened is there hasn't been the focus on bus prioritization in the way there should have been. And part of the challenge here is also the way we often end up with splitting the ministers responsible for transport. So you often end up with a roads minister and a public transport minister. And when you split the two, you've got to get both of them to agree. And that is often not that easy. So if you've got a roads minister who's like focused on predominantly keeping the roads congestion free, or trying to at least, they're not going to be in favour of a measure which is taking away a lane of general traffic, because they're not going to get they're not going to see the benefit in their mind from making the bus service faster. The Minister for Public Transport might think that was a great idea, but the Minister for Roads is not. So you've got to have a situation where the Minister for Transport looks after both roads and public transport to start with, and then has the vision, and then is willing to put in the effort around bus priorities. And for whatever reason, we haven't been doing that, partly I suspect because we've been focusing a lot on trains and light rail in recent years.
Which are restricted to very few corridors, and they have a very high speed. Whereas a conversion of a lane on each side of the road on a 6-lane road to high occupancy vehicle or a bus lane basically costs nothing.
Yep.
Except vehicle capital.
Oh, 100%. Like in terms of policy, I don't think, you and I would be 100% aligned on this. And I think the vast majority of people, whether they're traffic engineers or, transport system experts, will be going, we need more dedicated bus lanes, right? Dedicated bus lanes are a really good thing for our transport systems. Okay. And yes, you may have some difficulty in implementation, but once things settle down, you will have a much better system overall. Right? I actually think that most politicians would get that as well. And I think one of the things we've got to work through is how do you make it easier for them to take that leap and make that decision? This isn't like, for me, I think politicians struggle with induced demand as a concept. Okay. And we talked about how, there's a lot of transport experts that struggle with induced demand, right? So politicians are another step away from that. But I think in terms of bus priority, politicians do get that generally, those in charge of public transport. But I think what they're looking for is how can we make it easy for them to make a decision on bus priority? And I have to say, I don't necessarily see people coming forward from the departments of transport and going, we need bus prioritization. Here's a really easy way of doing it, or here's how to make it much more politically acceptable. And to some extent, that's not their role, right? But it does put the emphasis on the politician, and there are not many great examples right now of how to do this without creating a lot of pain.
Yeah. So, speaking to the Sydney case, we've just had the Bus Reform Task Force release their second report, which, upon reading, took me back to 2003 and the Unsworth Review, because it was basically a very expensive copy and paste, with but a lot of the same people involved in the authorship, interestingly enough. But, different politicians, different generation.
Well, in fairness, like, none of these things are new for buses, right? It's not as though we haven't known about the best practice in buses. And it's suddenly a revelation that we need dedicated bus lanes and good high frequency and reliability.
Well,
these are not new concepts, are they?
I disagree there. It was a sudden revelation to the current minister that we needed these things.
I appreciate that. Sorry, I meant in terms of transport experts, right? In terms of our understanding of how transport systems need to work. I mean, there's always, non-experts like politicians who you have to get up to speed. But in terms of transport experts and making bus networks work, there's not been huge amounts of stuff that's changed. I think the only perhaps thing that's really been perhaps a significant sort of innovation and of doing something differently is around, say, BRT, for example, bus rapid transit. And copying what's been done elsewhere in that sort of space. But if you would have asked a bus expert 30 years ago, what needs to be done, and asked a bus expert today what needs to be done, I would not be surprised if like 95% of the things were the same, and the differences were around things like some use of technology and data and those sorts of things that weren't possible 30 years ago but are possible today.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because we've seen a deliberate, like any transport system, buses have gone through phases and fads, I suppose, where we were spending a lot of money putting in dedicated bus lanes and they were being very successful. And then different people come in and they start putting in dedicated car lanes with a little bit of bus features, so the queue jumps, and say, well, we're doing bus priority by getting cars out of the way of buses. Which takes me back to our induced demand discussion of increasing car capacity in order to reduce congestion as a bus priority measure is not a bus priority measure.
Yes.
And that's where we are at the moment.
Yes, which is why and this goes back to the point, of trying to find ways of leveraging different tools to make it less of a leap to go from general traffic to full bus lane. Right? Are there ways, and that was the point of in my blog. Now, whether carpooling works or not, it will depend on your particular circumstances. In some places, it does seem to work in some scenarios. The vast majority, it doesn't. Okay. If you can find places where it does, it will potentially work. I think that's a lower hanging fruit to convert a lane into a high occupancy vehicle lane than if you're just going straight to a bus lane.
Yeah. And taking us back to the starting topic of carpooling, if you're an employer, supporting your staff in carpooling means your costs of parking go down. So you can, if you have a campus, you can actually redevelop your parking into facilities. If so you're doing manufacturing, you can build more factory by having carpooling and taking away some of the car parking that would have been used by all individual cars.
If I was in somewhere like Macquarie Park, right, I'd be like, you can build a whole bunch of housing and mixed use buildings on the vast swathes of car parks they have that already that are in the town or in that precinct already. For the owners of those assets, if they can reduce the amount of parking required for their tenants, it's massive amounts of money that they could make. So there's good incentives there. Although I think but the planning system often prevents them, by the way, because you try to redevelop a car park, and historically I have seen the transport evaluation going, well, then you're going to need wider roads everywhere. I'm like, but you're removing the parking. It's like this is got to be made sense, but if you're replacing dedicated parking and a car park and just replacing it for 1-for-1 in an apartment building, you can see why people get nervous about the extra demand and all the rest of it. But if you're looking to shift the mode dramatically, then you should be able to rethink this. But it's also, I think you can also increase incentives. It's going back to things like the parking space levies. Do you have a parking space levy in the place where you're trying to encourage them to reduce the amount of parking that's there?
Yeah, and increasing charges and taxation on parking is a good, along with improving other services, is a good financial signal to encourage people not to drive themselves.
Yes. But we also provide significant sort of tax incentives as well around cars. So employers pay for car leases.
Yeah, well, that's a historical artifact. Wanting to have a car manufacturing industry, which probably should have gone when we got rid of the car manufacturing industry. But that's for another.
There's a lot of stuff like that around policies, things which stick there. But so where have we got to then? Carpooling,
Yeah,
not a panacea.
Yeah. So, Russell, you've been reading up quite a bit on autonomous vehicles lately. I've historically done some work on them. What do you think about AVs and carpooling? Do you think it's going to be the magic solution? Will Elon Musk's robo-bus get people to share?
I think it's fair to say that I'm
skeptical. We all go around in our own little robo-taxi and don't share vehicles.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the utopian view for autonomous vehicles is that it'll be shared, and multiple people will use the vehicles, and we'll need a lot less cars on the road, and congestion will be significantly reduced, and everything will be wonderful in our cities. I think it's fair to say I'm probably skeptical about that if you don't provide significant incentives to make that happen. If we just allow autonomous vehicles onto the roads for all the reasons you talked about in the carpooling, right, is that people won't share those vehicles. I also think then you end up with people will like having their own car as they do now. It just happens to be an autonomous vehicle. And I think that means that you'll end up with private ownership. They won't be shared. They'll still only have one vehicle, one occupant. So I think when you add all of those things together, for autonomous vehicles, I actually think it will be, it won't support carpooling generally.
Yeah, I agree with that, particularly in the ride-hailing transportation network company view of the world. And we're seeing this already, where robo-taxis are being deployed. When you take out the human cost element, which is the biggest ongoing operational expense, aside from cloud computing, etc., the cost of travel goes down. And we know from our discussion about congestion and induced demand is when you reduce the cost of travel, Jevons paradox means that people will travel more. So you can't, by having robo-taxis, you will inevitably increase demand and congestion.
Indeed. And that's without taking into account other factors around robo-taxis, like, whereas most of our cars these days spend 95% of their time parked, robo-taxis will not do that. They will spend a very small proportion of their time parked, typically, and it may well be that they are sent back home after dropping off their occupant, for example, with no one in the car.
Well, or fill up public car parks to the annoyance of the neighbours, as per some quite famous cases in San Francisco with Waymos getting in the way of each other within a public park and honking at each other.
Yes, some teething problems there.
Yes. Well, when when a company says, "Oh, it's all on the cloud and it's all networked and connected," and then every individual vehicle behaves like a 5-year-old child who only thinks about themselves. It doesn't seem to be that well coordinated or connected. Indeed.
All right. Should we wrap it up there then, Graham?
I think so. So, yeah, in summary, outside of employment, carpooling doesn't really seem to work as a concept. That just incentivizes people to be the people who want to drive to be selfish, and other members of the community who might use transit or walking or cycling fill the gap and provide the extra occupants. That would be my summary of thoughts on carpooling. What about you, Russell?
I'm perhaps less skeptical than you are. I think there's potential. I think we're making it easier in terms of the matching and things, and some areas do seem to be doing well on it, but it's not been easy. It's not easy, for sure. And I think you're right. In many contexts, I don't think it would work. I think it's an interesting one where you're talking about, long corridors where there's lots of people coming from one area and going to another area. I think the potential there is greater. But I also think then you've got to get your enforcement right, and that is a challenge. But I think if you did those things, I think you end up with interesting effects where you might end up with losing a few people on public transit. But if you've created a situation where your bus is now a lot quicker and you've increased services, etc., down that corridor because you've now got much more freedom to to prioritize buses, you could well offset quite a lot of that through those increases. And the number of if you then regulate the number of people that are able to use the high occupancy vehicle lane, because you need to keep those buses moving. I wonder whether your secondary and tertiary effects are in effect that you end up with a significant net positive, even if you lose some people at the front end.
Yeah. And before anybody comments, and I'm sure they will anyway, yes, universities as well are also where carpool for people who are in the same course.
Yeah, and I think in France, I think it was BlaBlaCar, I think that sort of used university students going to the same location as a successful carpooling operation.
Yeah, and a lot of universities do have carpooling schemes and do make it work viably, but it's the same as employers. It's a small, narrow subset of the community who have a common purpose.
Yeah,
not complete strength. So with that, thanks, Russell.
Thank you, Graham.
And feel free to comment, like, subscribe, buy us a coffee, join our Patreon, and look out for our next podcast.